Good morning, brothers. Good to be with you through this technology. So today we're going to talk about monasticism, popes, and patriarchs, and hopefully you'll get a little better idea of what that looks like and is. So during the persecutions that we've talked about in the early church, there was little push towards monasticism. People were sort of just hanging on, trying to keep things together, and so there wasn't a lot of sort of what we would call monasticism today. But going into the time of when when Christianity became the state religion, we see a rise in thousands of monks who were reacting against the beginning of abuses and worldliness within the secularized church. And so by secularized church, I mean the church that was part of the actual accepted by the state. And so monasteries started developing first in Egypt, and then they spread over the whole empire. And as the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages that we're talking about now, and remember that term Dark Ages is kind of a misnomer, but the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, as this time period descended over Europe after the fall of the empire, monasteries continued to be the main source, really, of literacy for almost 1,000 years, from 500, the year AD 500, all the way up until the time of the Reformation in around 1500. So these monasteries really became the centers of intellectual life. Now, there are three types of monastic life, three main types of monastic life. There were those who were ministers in their congregations who lived like sort of half monks, a life of asceticism, but continued to be involved in the lives of people. That type of monk or a monastery would describe Augustine. Augustine had his friends that he was in the monastery together with, and they had sort of, like, if you think about like a private home or a private place where they lived their lives, and they lived a life of asceticism, depriving their physical bodies of things, but yet he was the bishop of Hippo, and he interacted with his church and was very involved in his people's lives. And then there were those who separated completely. They separated completely from all work and all human interaction. They clothed themselves in skins, or something very, very scant. They ate bread and salt alone. They only drank water. They lived in caves and became extreme hermits. And these were called the desert monks. Athanasius wrote about Saint Anthony, and he was one of those guys in his book, The Life of Antony, that you can read about, and he lived in the desert of Egypt. And then there was another group of monks, and those were the ones that lived in cloisters or communes, and what we would probably think of as a monastery today. And these were groups of men that lived together. They engaged in manual labor together. They centered their lives around devotions and study, and the excess food they raised on their monastery together, they used to help the poor. And so that is really probably what we really think of when we think of a monastery. Now, during the High Middle Ages, many voices began calling for a return to the monastic ideal of sort of like 500 years before that, during the time of Benedict, that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Monastic communities had originally been established as places of separation, a place to withdraw from the world and completely focus on your own spiritual condition and the spiritual condition of your fellow monks and folks on the monastery. And so that was this separate community living together in a cloister. The first real guy that started this in 540, his name was Benedict of Nursia, And Benedict had developed some of the first communal monasteries in the early 6th century. Like I said, about 540, he wrote his rule, the Benedict's rule, and he developed this order around the area called Monte Cassino in Italy, and just outside, not too far outside of Rome. And he is known for establishing his rule, which governed, so the rule of Benedict, which governed what the monastery was to look like. And there were, so in other words, there were to be times of prayer, and there's times of study, and there were times of work. And so you had these principles as well of poverty and chastity. Chastity is like purity, especially sexual purity, service, obedience to the head of the monastery. And so these principles were to govern the monastic life, and Benedict laid those out into an order or a rule of how to live that out. Corruption, just like wherever you have any human institution, corruption gradually begins to enter into some of the monastic communities, and it did that. And so we have sinners living amongst each other, and so corruption begins to enter into those monasteries. And certain monastic communities accumulated considerable wealth, for instance, and became really places of luxury instead of houses of prayer and service. Now, throughout the 11th and 12th century, new monastic orders such as the Cluniacs and the Cistercians also emerged with a renewed emphasis on traditional monastic principles. One of these guys that was very important in the Middle Ages was Bernard of Clairvaux. And Bernard of Clairvaux was a passionate Cistercian abbot, and he became the symbol for the Middle Ages of the ideal monk. Bernard lived from 1090 until about 1153, and he was a wise and learned monk. Bernard served as an advisor to popes and other powerful officials. Bernard zealously advocated personal holiness and living a disciplined, self-denying Christian life, and he practiced that himself. Bernard also cultivated a great knowledge of God and of the human soul, and in Dante's, to give you an idea of what that looks like, in Dante's book Paradiso, Bernard serves as the guide who leads the pilgrim through heaven and toward God. And so that's how popular he was. You'll actually hear a little bit more about Bernard and read some about Bernard as well. Now, as the 12th century drew to an end, monasticism was beginning to find new expressions in what they called the mendicant orders. And while most monks had withdrawn into monastic communities, like the Benedictines and even the Augustinians by this time, and those were some of the earlier monasteries and monastic communities. As we move into the 12th and 13th centuries, we have some different ideas of what a monastery should be. And so we have the friars of what's called the mendicant orders. And so, again, most monks had withdrawn to the monastic communities. Now we have these mendicant orders. And the friars of the mendicant orders spent their time among the common people. And these orders combined a lifestyle of self-denial with an active preaching ministry and an active service ministry. The most influential figures of these new mendicant orders were Francis of Assisi and Dominic of Osma. And so the mendicant orders, what is that? Mendicant means simply they were living by begging. They were relying upon other people to really feed them. So there was a time of tremendous decline in Europe from 500 to 1100. And that is the time that if anybody's going to say anything about the Dark Ages, that would be time when you could really say this is the Dark Ages. So there was a lot of decline after the fall of the Roman Empire, and it was taking time for things to kind of get back underway. And it was like 500 or 600 years that it was taking some recovery, and some of the areas of Europe didn't recover until the time of the Reformation and the Renaissance, just before the Reformation. So now, and around 1100, there's now this beginning of the Crusades, and with the Crusades really begins a renewal of trade and money and growth of cities, and that all is coinciding at the same time. And so this sets the stage really at this point for a rise in the gap between the rich and the poor. And so there's this new class called the bourgeoisie. And this bourgeoisie class rises up. It's a merchant class. And so some are just businessmen now, rather than just farmers living on the land, eking out a living. Now there becomes things to trade. And as trade expands outside of Europe, they are bringing things in to be able to bring in and trade and sell, and so you develop this merchant class. And some people become very wealthy. Some become wealthy as kings, maybe even more than kings. And so people are moving away from the monasteries, which is interesting. So small towns across Europe were set up with a monastery and a church right at the middle of your town or your small village. And so you have your local church and the monastery with the monks serving, and that's probably where your pastor lives or serves in some regard. And now people looking for a better opportunity from their lives out in the small villages, looking for more opportunity of making money, begin to leave some of those small villages and head into the cities. I think you may actually experience some of that in India and Nepal, as the cities of India and Nepal begin to really blossom with trade and with business and medical business and things like that. That's what you have going on there. From what I've seen. So they're leaving their small towns, going to the cities, hoping to find better lifestyles, better opportunities for their families. And the main motivating factor behind this was indeed money. With this coupled the immense removal of morality, and so you have this decline in morality. So in other words, when you're outside of where your pastor is, when you're outside of where your family is, and you've gone on your own to a city, now you have this removal of morality. And so in other words, there's nobody to really keep you in check, and so sometimes you can go off on your own doing things. And so during this period of time, there was a rich, fairly wealthy merchant of Lyon, which is in Gaul or France, and his name was Peter Waldo. And in the 12th century, he sort of was had money, and he wanted to do something with it. He became saved, and he wanted to help people, and so he began to work through some things. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about him a little bit later. You'll actually see some and read a little bit more about him. So Peter Waldo heard a story of a monk who practiced extreme asceticism and poverty, and so Peter Waldo was moved by that and decided to dedicate himself to poverty and preaching. And so he was a lay person. He hadn't had any training, but he grasped hold of God's word and got hold of whatever he could in God's word, and followers gathered around him. And as followers gathered around him, he was forbidden by the archbishop of this region to preach because he was a lay person. And so he continued to preach, continued to do what he felt God was calling him to do. But then he also then continued on doing what he was told not to do. And in the meantime, eventually he sent some folks down to Rome to see if they could have their own order. Well, the Pope in Rome embarrassed the people, Waldo's followers, and so they ended up being persecuted, a really persecuted group of people called the Waldensians. And the Waldensians, as they developed into their persecution, they flocked into the big mountains in Central Europe called the Alps, and hid out in valleys until the time of the Reformation, and really became part of the Reformation after that. There's another merchant from Assisi, and his name was Giovanni. And Giovanni experienced a moving experience that led him to embrace poverty. He had a wealthy family, and so he gave all that he had to the poor. And so his friends nicknamed him Francesco, which means little Frenchman. And so he, forever after that, was called Francis. And he gave his wealth, all he had, to the poor. He dressed in rags. He traveled about preaching poverty. He served people. He rebuilt abandoned chapels. He praised the beauty and harmony of nature. He gave up his inheritance and gave everything that he had, left naked into the woods, and became a hermit for a time. And then in 1209, he heard Matthew 10:7 to 10 preach. Jesus sends his disciples to preach, taking no gold or silver. And so this really has an impact upon him, and he joins poverty and preaching together. And so feels called to go to the poor and the sick in the cities, and do that through poverty and the preaching of God's word. Now, Francis gained approval of Pope Innocent III, and you're going to read and learn a little bit more about Innocent III later on this week. And so Pope Innocent III gave him permission to start his new order, and so he returned to Assisi with his new order of Lesser Brothers, it was called. And so they eventually became known as the Franciscans. So he sends out the brothers, the friars, to go out preaching and singing and begging. And they dress in coarse robes. And Francis forbids them to own anything, even a psalter or the sacramental books or even a Bible of any kind, anything. Prevents them and calls them not to own anything, because this would create materialism in the friars. If they wanted this, if they wanted a book, if they wanted a Bible, if they wanted a psalter, if they wanted a sacramental book, if they wanted anything, if they owned anything, what would they want next? So he tried to set up this limit in his order. He had moderate success in that. He died in October of 1226. And in 1228, he was canonized as Saint Francis of Assisi, just 2 years after his death. Francis was the first saint considered to have received something called the stigmata. And so reports spread that the wounds of Christ had actually appeared on Francis's body near the end of his life. So the wounds in Jesus' hand and the wounds in his feet and his brow where the crown of thorns was placed, this is called the stigmata, and it was said that Francis actually received that. That's how sort of holy he was. And so it was believed to be a miraculous indication of a close connection with Christ. That's how holy he was. Well, I'm not sure that was a true thing, but that was what was said about him. Now, another mendicant was named Dominic, and he was a Spanish friar who was from 1170 until 1221, and he set up his Augustinian order with a new twist in 1203. And he was a contemporary of Francis as well. Dominic's personality and emphases were distinct from those of Francis. Dominic believed asceticism will attract people to them. Francis believed asceticism will attract people to them. And so So Dominic sets out to preach orthodoxy while living a monastic life of poverty, mendicancy, that is, begging, and disciplined study. And that's the different twist. So poverty, begging, and disciplined study. Dominic was committed to really careful study into the intellectual defense of the faith, defending the faith against heretics. And so he really devoted that to his order. For Dominic, poverty was not an end in itself, but rather a means of ridding oneself from distractions for the sake of study. And so study becomes very important to the Dominicans. And he and his followers become the refuters of heresy. And they need to study in order to be intellectually challenging to the heretics that would rise up. And with this, his decidedly intellectual character, Dominic was interested in combating heresy and false doctrine. Dominic sought to raise up an order of educated defenders of the faith who would be preachers and teachers of the common people. And he established the Ordo Praetorium, also known as the Order of Preachers, or the Dominican Order. And you will actually see them still have that little title, OP, after their names if they're a part of the Dominican Order, even down to this day. So this order was fueled by the conviction that Christianity was worthy of intellectual defense and in need of capable defenders. And so Dominic was canonized after his death in 1234, and his order continued to develop into one of the most influential groups within the medieval church. And so one of the most famous Dominicans became Thomas Aquinas. Now, after his death, he was credited with receiving the idea of the rosary from the Virgin Mary. And so, you know, if you know anything about Roman Catholics, they pray the rosary, and it's a series of beads, and they will pray down through these beads with a prayer for each one. And he supposedly, people said, after he was dead, of course, because they couldn't check then with him, that was said that he received the rosary idea from the Virgin Mary directly. Now, later developments in the mendicant orders, we had the Franciscans. After Francis died, they disputed amongst themselves. Some remained devoted to Francis' ideals of that real poverty, and others said circumstances changed and they became less strict. Eventually, the Franciscans owned land and stressed intellectualism, and would become a bit of a typical monastery with, you know, grounds and all of that where they lived. A lot of people really, if you think of monks, you're going to think of Franciscans. The Dominicans, their ideal became preaching, teaching, and study, and poverty was put aside. They became less and less impoverished, and they developed money, and so people wanted to give them money. And they began to have many Dominican professors in the new universities that were forming, so many of the professors were Dominicans. And they tried to convert Muslims and Jews, and that was one of their outreaches that they had, and eventually became persecutors of some of those. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans became the predominant orders in the High Middle Ages, but there also remained many Augustinians and Benedictine monasteries as well. Let's talk briefly about the Pope. So the Pope, that word simply means father. And the Bishop of Rome has now become known as the Pope. So he's the Pope and the leader of the Roman Catholic Church worldwide. And in the Roman Catholic mind, he's the leader of the Church Universal. So all Christians should subscribe to the Pope or the papacy. But this position of Pope was not always clear, and the title was added after the first centuries of the Church for the purpose of control and power and Christian influence. In fact, it wasn't until the 11th century that the title Pope came to apply solely to the Bishop of Rome. Other bishops would be given that title a little bit as well, simply meaning Papa, or father. Okay, and so other bishops were called that as well, as sort of a title of respect that you might have. In India, that might be something like, when I was there, I was called uncle, and so a title of respect. So the office grew. So the office itself grew in particular influence after the decline of the Roman Empire, though. And so it took the fall of the Roman Empire to really bring this about. And it was a kind of a stability for the people, tracing its roots back to the first pope in Rome, who the Roman Catholic Church believes to be the Apostle Peter. And so the Roman Catholic Church takes pride in its long, uninterrupted history, saying that they're the true historical church, but is that really the real story? Peter, of course, never used or bore the title Pope. Moreover, there is no evidence that Jesus appointed Peter to be the Bishop of Rome, nor did Jesus establish the papacy, nor did he lay his hands on Peter and say, "You are now the head of the church, you are the Pope." So where did that idea come from that Peter was the head of the church? Well, it developed out of Matthew 16:18, when Jesus told Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." And so the Roman Catholic Church takes rock to mean Peter. The Greek word for Peter is Petra, which means rock, though this interpretation is probably untrue. Notwithstanding, even if the Roman Catholic Church argues in favor of this interpretation, the issue of papal succession is something entirely different and not found in the pages of Scripture. And so you have the Roman Catholics sometimes arguing for papal succession, where Peter laid his hands on the next one, Clement, and then beyond him it would be the next one, and so forth. And so there's this continual papal succession all the way down to our current day. Well, that's just not found in history or the Scriptures. It's a figment of the imagination. Just because Jesus designated Peter to be an early church leader of the early church does not give a succession of non-apostles the same kind of apostolic authority that is claimed for the papacy, especially to the degree that we see today, including the doctrine of papal infallibility. So when the Pope sits on his throne and he speaks ex cathedra, he speaks infallibly, just like God would speak. It would be sort of like Christ himself speaking. At various times throughout the church history as well, you have, during especially like the 14th century in Avignon, France, you have multiple popes. You have a pope in Rome, you have a pope in Avignon, France, all claiming the title of popes. And at one point there was even 3 who were claiming to be popes in the 14th century. And so that's all to say that this is sort of a made-up thing by the Roman Catholic Church. At the same time, we shouldn't get the idea that all popes were bad or evil. One of the most famous popes of the early Middle Ages was Pope Gregory, and Pope Gregory I that we talked about a little bit last week, and you'll talk a little bit more about him today, I believe. And so he's known as Gregory the Great. And Gregory had great leadership and humility and became a shining light of biblical Christianity in a sea of darkness. And he introduced Christian devotion and a concern for evangelism, and he affirmed the importance of moral behavior. And before Gregory became a pope, he lived as a monk, dedicating his life to imitating the life of Jesus through contemplation, service, and a disdain for worldliness. So, we've talked about Gregory a little bit, and he's became evangelistic and sent missionaries into the British Isles, and all of that. That's a interesting story, but a story for another day. The whole conversion of the British Isles. So a defining moment came on Christmas Day in the year 800 for the papacy, when Pope Leo III crowned the King of France, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, king. And as the first Roman Empire in more than 3 centuries and ruler over what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. So Charlemagne became that man, and he was crowned on Christmas Day in the year 800 by Pope Leo. This set the stage for some controversy between church and state, or helped to set the stage. And one of those things that helped set the stage for the whole controversy between church and state that we find in the Middle Ages or the medieval world. And so it was sort of seen that like he was like we're back to the Roman Empire that we had back in the 300s. And the church and state becoming one, and with the church owning or crowning and owning the leadership of the empire. And so Charlemagne believed that the church, especially the clergy, was necessary for a well-ordered and quality society, but he wanted if he wanted functional control over Europe, he must also have direct control over the church. And so Charlemagne was also spurred on church reforms and learning, and often serving as the patron for a number of scholars. And he had really was an educational king, and believed very strongly in education and educating the people, and especially the nobility, so people could read and read the Bible and read other works, and he knew that that was an important thing. And Charlemagne also became the patron for a number of scholars, so that schools could be set up, and these eventually would become the universities of Europe. He set up and gave money to the monasteries in order to preserve ancient texts in the monasteries. And so one of the great legacies that Charlemagne had to do with his military campaigns, though, as well against the growing militant religion of Islam. And so Islam becomes this major thing that we're going to talk about as well this week. Now, just briefly about patriarchs. I said we were going to talk about patriarchs as well. Patriarchs are the leaders, the bishops of the Eastern Empire. And so each city in the Eastern Empire would have its own patriarch. You had one in Constantinople, and another one in Alexandria, another one in Antioch. And so these different patriarchs would be bishops. And so that's really the term that is used in the Eastern Orthodox churches, even down to our day. And so there's simply the bishops of their particular cities. And so some very famous ones, and we've already talked about some of those more famous ones as well. Well, that's it. And study hard. You got a big week ahead of you. And so lots of reading, and we're going to do a lot in 3 days. And then you'll have some time to work on your studies and on Thursday and Friday of this week. So hopefully you'll be able to do well. Feel free to reach out to me via email, or you can get my WhatsApp number from Prem as well if you have any questions and need any help with anything. So I'm perfectly willing to help you out in whatever way I can. Have a great week.